Hello and welcome to another episode of Love Revolution. I'm your host, Mia Saenz. And in this segment, sitting right next to me, you'll see Rebecka Eggers. Now, Rebecka and I go back several years. We're colleagues and we're friends, as you've met some of my other friends and colleagues. The reason I say this is because she is a huge support for me in many ways. Not only is she a writer for the magazine, but she's been International Women's Director, and also she does a lot of our editorials, which is fantastic. She's an amazing woman. And her thought process on the way that she coaches is amazing because she is not afraid. So many people are afraid to look at the depth of the issue is. She is not, and she digs right in. I call her my beautiful priestess, but she is more of a chaos jockey or an instigator, but as a coach, she is out of a trauma coach. She takes you out of trauma and into living the life that you desire and dream. So, as always, pause here if you don't have your notepads and your pens and everything that you want to have on this retreat, and make yourself comfortable and do your breathing exercises, but also don't forget your drink. So, come back when you're fully breathed, when you have fully done all your breathing and everything that you're ready to go, then hit unpause, hit pause to get your stuff, and then hit unpause to bring us on. And I'd like you to meet Rebecka Eggers. Hi, Rebecka.
Hi, Mia.
How are you, honey?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. It's wonderful to have you here. And everyone, she's joining us from Mexico. She moved to Mexico 4 years ago, 5 years ago, something like that.
A little over 4 years ago.
Yeah, and that's when I met her, so it's really cool. And also, you might hear some noises in the background on her end and my end. We both live in noisy parts of the city, and I'm in Los Angeles and she's in Mexico. So it's great to have you here, honey.
Thanks, Mia. Yeah, I always tell my clients anything could happen in the background of one of my sessions. Explosions, honking, the gas company dragging aluminum on the asphalt to tell us they're in the neighborhood. So be prepared for a noise extravaganza.
But we're going to enjoy this. Awesome. So I'm going to turn it over to you. Will you share a little bit of your background story with us, and then just begin teaching, and I'll ask you questions because your stuff always intrigues me.
Okay, thanks, Mia. Okay, so my background. I have a degree in psychology, I have a law degree, and a master's in taxation, which is an advanced legal degree. And basically, I was a lawyer until 4.5 years ago, when things changed dramatically. I ended up going to Tulum for Christmas in 2009, and I met someone during that vacation who introduced me to the Zapatista rebel movement in Chiapas. And at that time in my life, I was really struggling with unhappiness. I didn't understand the source of my unhappiness, but I knew that I was deeply unhappy despite having plenty of money in the bank, the ability to take all the vacations I wanted in the world, subject to, time limitations, and just really having everything going for me. And I still would get up every morning and I would promise I was going to have a good day. And by 9 o'clock, I was just, undone again. So I went on this vacation. It was kind of a searching vacation. And boy, did I get some answers. I went home and I immediately started studying everything about this rebel movement in Chiapas, Mexico. And by April, I was on a plane down to Mexico. I didn't even know that there was an airport an hour from here. So I started out 7 hours north in Villahermosa and made my way south and up into the mountains, which was a beautiful transition from modern culture to, people living in very humble means and running alongside the highway, children running alongside the highway trying to sell things to the bus, and just this very sort of basic, different experience. And I was actually in search of the rebels, and I will say that I did manage to have one encounter with them. It was sort of funny because I was so moved by the experience that all I could do was cry, actually. So they thought I was this crazy crying gringo without much to say, and to them it really looked like I was wasting their time. But for me, it was the beginning of the end of my old life. All of a sudden, because of my contact with this movement, this group of indigenous rebels who had managed to learn really how to define themselves and how to stand up for themselves and create boundaries in their lives. This is an actual armed conflict, so they actually rose up in a revolution in 1994. And since then have been able to create really thriving communities. So all of a sudden I had this example of traumatized people who were really able to establish clear boundaries in their own lives, for lack of a better term. I mean, that sounds sort of North American and woo-woo compared to what it actually is. But they were able to really carve out a place for their own thriving here in the mountains of Mexico. And also to come in contact with the suffering that's just really a part of poverty, put me in touch with kind of my own suffering. You know, it made it okay for me to begin to touch the anguish that I was carrying around. Now, if someone had told me back in 2010 that my real problem was unresolved trauma, I would have probably punched them in the face and walked away, because I had a lot wrapped up in the idea that I was fine. I was searching for answers, but I was fine. It was the ultimate paradox. Well, anyway, I didn't last very much longer before my entire world completely blew apart. And I wound up, within a space of about 45 days, collapsing at work, ended up, having to take leave from work, ultimately ended up leaving my profession. My daughter went to live with her father, so that I could begin to recover. And I was really sort of forced into all of a sudden facing the buried traumas that I didn't understand at that time were beginning to surface with a vengeance. I mean, we're talking about like profound sexual violation, domestic violence that happened to me when I was in my teens. I lost my mom to a violent murder when I was in my early 20s. And just, some really difficult stuff that I had suppressed until I came in contact with people who weren't suppressing their trauma and who were actually addressing it in a very practical, straightforward, committed way. I'm not sure they would even describe things the way that I'm describing them, but that's what it offered to me, was a lens, into what it looked like to actually love yourself and define yourself and stake out a space for yourself in the world. So that's my story kind of in a nutshell.
Thank you. It's great. So you're here today to share with us about boundaries and love. And it's pretty big stuff. So everybody hold on, buckle up, and enjoy.
Yeah, hopefully enjoy. So I'm going to actually be talking a little bit about how we learn to love, and I'm going to go into some of the brain science in very layman's terms. I'm not a brain scientist, but I do study the brain science of trauma as a part of the work that I do, and I have found it to be really revolutionary in terms of what it taught me. So in terms of what I'm calling my talk today, it's going to be stop with the love already. Right? Because we have all these spiritual movements, and some of them are very ancient, and I'm not even questioning the wisdom of these movements in general. I'm questioning the wisdom of how we often apply them in modern society, where they wind up being a bypass or a reinforcer for our traumas. So what I'm talking about is these traditions that urge us into loving kindness practice, forgiveness, love your enemy, and all of these are really laudable ideas. And at some point in your recovery from trauma, there's an opening for that, but most people who've had trauma actually wind up doing these practices and reinforcing their trauma coping strategies. So I want to talk first, before we get into that, I want to talk a little bit about how it is that we learn to love, from a brain perspective. So basically, when we're born with about the social capacity of a snake, right? Our reptilian brain is fully developed and functioning when we come out of the womb, but our social brain is actually largely unformed. That's the moment in time when we actually can begin to transition into being truly social creatures. And the reason I'm saying that, which it's a slight exaggeration, right? Because we've all had warm, fuzzy moments with our newborn babies. But it's kind of if we think of it that way, it provides a kind of stark contrast that lays the foundation for what I'm going to say next, which is that basically the social part of our brain, or the limbic brain, isn't very developed when we're born. And it actually develops in partnership with the people we're born to. So that's a really fabulous thing. If you're born into a family that truly knows how to love in a supportive, selfless, kind of unconditional way that children need up to a certain point in their development. But if you're born into trauma, it's actually like a recipe for lifelong difficulties in loving. So that's another reason that I say, stop with the love already, because we really have to rewire the way we love. Okay, so does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. It does.
Okay. So how this actually works is that our limbic brain really entrains to the people around us. So when we're born, we have our neurons that sort of fire spontaneously in relation to whatever's happening around us. But then over time, as we really bond with our tribe or family, our neurons begin to fire the way that their neurons fire. And then as they begin to fire, they also begin to bundle together or get wired together while they're firing, right? So you start out with this kind of I imagine it kind of like a game of whack-a-mole, kind of neurons going like this, right? Mm-hmm. But as we begin to set these patterns, we don't have this spontaneous firing so much anymore, even when there's spontaneous stimuli. So we get groups of neurons that, okay, this one fired with this one before, so that's what they start doing, right? But it gets even deeper than that. Not only do we fire along the same lines as the people we're with and begin to form these neuron bonds, I would say, or bundles is what I'm going to call them in very layman's terms, but we actually start to form attractors. So this neuron fires and attracts someone who's firing a kind of mirror image, right? Or someone fires and we create a mirror image. And we build these attractors into our brains. And before long, we're really attracted to people who are in our neuron pattern. They're in our limbic brain pattern, right? And then it goes deeper than that. Not only are we attracted to them and attracting them, but we become kind of blind to people and circumstances that are outside our patterns. Does all that make sense?
Yeah. And I want to say stuff, but I'm going to hold off.
No, go ahead. Toss something out there.
I'm this is why we have to change our thought process radically. Okay, go ahead.
Yes, exactly. Well, you know me. I'm a super, super skeptic about all of the sort of we are one stuff and all of that. I started out kind of searching for answers in the New Age movement and the spirituality movements that are so popular right now. And I really got burned out on them and disappointed in them, and they seem to oversimplify things. And then I started looking at this brain science stuff, and I was like, we really do become one with the people who are around us. We really do create these pods of similar people, and we really do, with our thoughts and with the brain patterns that come up, we really do stay entrenched in those patterns. And so to shift from one group to another is really a radical reset of your thought processes and of your relationship experiences. So instead of sort of going down that road, I want to talk a little bit, or going further down it at this moment, because we're going to kind of come back to that. But I want to talk a little bit about kind of common love mistakes that people with trauma make. I'm going to call them love mistakes because they're really common bonding strategies and defense strategies that we call love, because we've been trained to love in that way by the exact process that I just laid out. So one of the common things that happens in trauma is what I would call self-compassion deficit. So what I mean by that is that we actually start to develop more empathy as a coping strategy for people who abuse us, then we actually develop compassion for ourselves. So this love your enemy thing, the loving kindness practices, they all kind of feed right into the tendency of trauma victims to go on to form these relationships based on over empathy with abusers or violators. And it doesn't even have to be, really what we think of as violent abuse, but just abusive patterns, codependency, that sort of thing. So you go in pre-wired to empathize with the other person and shut down your compassion for yourself. And the reason for that is because it can be really dangerous in these traumatic type relationships that some of us experienced in our early lives to actually have compassion for ourselves. And our survival often depends on our ability to identify with and really anticipate the needs of the people around us. This also kind of feeds into denial, which is another thing that we use to reinforce relationships. There's another level of this that actually goes even deeper, which I call, and again, this is in very layman's terms, but I call it merging, where we really underdevelop our sense of self and overdevelop our identification with other people. So it's a step further than anticipating someone else's needs and snapping to them. It's actually going so far as to lose your sense of self and become very identified with the other person's sense of self, so that you can fuse their desires and their needs for your own. And so you can see that when you reinforce this with the idea that we're going to love the world better, it just becomes a downward spiral into deepening those same brain patterns that we really learned early on. Another way that another common love error is something that this is kind of a technical term. We dissociate, right? So we separate ourselves, we separate our awareness of what's happening to us from the actual events, and we suppress it so that we actually, and we do this in a number of different ways. We may use denial, we may use fantasy life, but whatever it takes for us to really separate from our experience. And so we carry this later on into the relationships and the love that we try to form in our adult lives. Comments, questions?
No, it's true and it's interesting, and I'm glad you brought that up. I was just thinking about all the dissociation of clients and stuff while you were talking about that. Just putting stuff in my categories so I understand them.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the best way to describe it is really just not very present. Not very present to self, not very present to what's going on, really working overtime to let the other person off the hook and to anticipate what they need and give it to them. So when you reinforce this with, I always say that people want to activate the lover and they want to become really lovers of the world before they activate their warrior. And I think actually that's exactly backwards to what needs to happen. I think we need to actually activate the warrior and establish really clear, good boundaries in order for us to move out of the habits and patterns of trauma and the effects of trauma. And once the warrior is in place, and you go through a period when you do that where you just get like what I like to call, batshit crazy, right? Because all the anger that you've suppressed for so long starts coming up and you really don't know how to manage it. So you tend to have more outbursts and that sort of thing. But once you get that all recalibrated and you really come to a calmer place with it, then you can start to really establish the boundaries and really create an experience that's more conducive to a quality experience of loving that's reciprocal and healthy.
I have a question. It's back a little ways. I have a question on how would you suggest, if I can, or if you want to hold this off till later, how would you suggest those who have said, because I feel like I felt people, even though we're pre-recording this, saying, okay, so I might dissociate a little bit with a relationship or something like that from what you've said. How would you bring them into the present space of connecting to themselves to not dissociate?
Okay, so before I get into that, let me just explain a little bit about what's underlying all of this so that we have a foundation for actually addressing that. Okay, so you've all heard of fight, flight, freeze, right? So these are the most basic instinctual responses to threat. So when we are able to respond to a threat effectively, we first start out perhaps by asking for help. We call out to help. And if help doesn't come, or if that's not an available route, then we go into fight or flight. Well, either one of those is a good option if you are able to effectively address the threat. But when the threat is so big that you can't actually flee or fight and no one's coming to help you, you have only one remaining option, which is really to go into kind of a state of collapse. So what happens with trauma is you wind up having people who are either hyper aroused, so they're like in hypervigilance all the time, or you wind up with people who are in collapse. Mm-hmm. And the dissociative side is actually what I would say is often combined with the collapse piece. And that's all the coping strategies that I described earlier. So in order to start to address some of those things, we have a couple of options. So there's two parts of our brain that can really influence this. One is what I referred to earlier, which is the reptilian brain. And we can begin to address some of this on a body level by resetting our breath. So when you're in a state of just hyper arousal and you're just extremely anxious and looking for threat everywhere, you can actually use a breathing pattern that creates a kind of recovery in your nervous system. So that breathing pattern is a count of 3 breathing in and a count of 6 breathing out. So it's actually the long exhale that signals recovery for your body. If you actually have a tendency to be in collapse a lot, so that you tend to disappear into fantasies, when something's going wrong, you leave your body, you become really shut down, you can actually use a deep rhythmic breath, which will both give energy and calm. So that literally we can tap our own respiration to start resetting some of these patterns. Does that help?
That's awesome, yeah.
Okay.
Awesome.
So the other thing we can do is we can tap our logical brains. Oftentimes when I'm working with clients, I think actually what I'm doing is tapping both, because I'm having them doing deep breathing and then we're doing some like cognitive exercises that are designed to reset the trauma. But if you're really just working on this on your own, you can actually do things like yoga and mindfulness meditation that do engage the logical brain and begin to reset some of these patterns. So the mindfulness meditation in particular is really good because it provides you with insights, and it can also be very calming because it combines oftentimes with breathing. So those are some things you can do, both logical and more physiological, to reset the patterns of trauma.
Thank you. That's awesome.
Another thing that I think is really important is that you start to actually have a deeper sense of yourself. So one of the things I often do with my clients is have them do some core breathing exercises that are about having an experience of only their energy. And oftentimes when I introduce this breathing technique, I have people say, I don't even know what that feels like, right? So the instruction is that on your in-breath, you're breathing into what I call the core, which is about 3 fingers below your belly button. So on the in-breath, you're putting your awareness in the core. On the out-breath, you're pushing out the energy from your core with your breath to form this like bubble or barrier around you until you feel like you're really sitting there only in your own energy. So you begin to have an experience of your own desire. And this is where my clients often say, I don't even know what it feels like to have only an experience of my energy, only an experience of my desire, or even to have that intention. And so when that comes up, I have them actually start, if they can just get to the place where they can consciously visualize the bubble in place and kind of go from there. So I call this boundary breathing, right? Because you're really creating an energetic space for only you to be in touch with yourself. And this can often bring tremendous awareness to what the actual influences are that are separating you from yourself. And it can also help you to see where maybe you haven't developed a sense of self, and to start really spending more time developing your understanding of who you are and what you want and what you feel and experience when it's only you. Now, none of these things should ever be used as a substitute for taking radical action if you're in a dangerous situation. If you're in a situation that's just annoying or somewhat limited, I always say to people that we can really work with that, because that's the place where you can actually lean into your patterns and begin making some changes in how you respond. And like you said, Mia, to begin to reset the way you think about things. But if you're in a dangerous situation, you should definitely be reaching out for support in your community and taking action, because we're definitely not suggesting that you should stay in a dangerous or volatile situation and start trying to wake yourself up in the midst of that. For one thing, it's just a recipe for re-traumatizing yourself.
Thank you. That's awesome.
So how are we doing on time?
We're almost through.
Okay.
Wow,
okay.
that went fast. It went really fast. Wow.
Okay, so I actually, I want to introduce something. We've talked a lot about the problem. We've talked about some basic things you can do with your body to start resetting some of this. But I actually want to talk a little bit about where the real sort of meat is for getting out of some of this. I always tell people it's relationship that screwed you up, and it's relationship that's going to get you out of this. But it's actually not just any relationship. The best relationship to have is what I call sort of a repatterning relationship. And I developed a list of traits or characteristics of this relationship that I want to pass on to people today, so that as you begin to look for solutions, you begin to look for relational solutions that have the capacity to actually move you forward. So the first thing is neutrality. That means that your agenda is the same as this person's agenda. There becomes a kind of shared purpose between whoever the facilitator is, therapist or coach or spiritual leader, so that in contrast to your childhood, where the agenda of the parents to get what they needed or to do what they wanted to do, leading to neglect or whatever, is reversed by someone who comes into powerful alignment with the place you want to take your life. The second characteristic is caring. So the person should be genuinely invested in you achieving your desired outcome. They should actually care about you and your results. The person should also have skill. So not only should they understand the patterns and habits of trauma, but they should have the skill to actually build rapport with the part of your brain that is really entrenched in these patterns, so that the alarms don't go off and cause you to actually avoid this relationship. So they have to be able to build rapport with where you are and really be with where you are, at the same time holding a bigger vision for how to get you to a place where you're not suffering so much from these trauma patterns. Did that make sense, Mia?
It does.
Okay. So the person should also have a knowledge and understanding of the area they're working in. So people, no matter what discipline they're coming from, if they're working with trauma, they should actually have an understanding of trauma. Even if what they are is a shaman or a spiritual leader or some other kind of professional, they should understand their field. They should have a clear vision of the process that will take you from where you are to where you want to go, that will actually bring you the resolution and then take you through to building the behaviors and the strategies and that sort of thing that belong in the world of thriving. It should be a relationship of mutual trust and commitment to the process. And the person should actually have a high degree of empathy for you. So this is really reversing the pattern where you were in a high sense of empathy with someone who had very little empathy for you. You're going to be entering into a relationship with someone who has tremendous empathy for you and your situation and is actually there as a facilitator of your growth instead of as someone who's sort of receiving from you in a parasitic kind of way.
And this is awesome because it teaches people to become receivers. Yeah.
Definitely. And, you know, I always say that with my daughter and with my clients, one of the greatest gifts that I ever give is the gift of my neutrality and my presence. So really, I just want to help people to become all of who they potentially could be when all of this stuff is cleared away.
That's awesome.
And in terms of then, like, actually crossing over, is this a good time for me to actually share my sort of modified loving kindness practice?
Is this the breath one you were going to do?
No, we already went through the breath stuff.
Okay.
This is my loving kindness practice. So there comes a point after you activate the warrior and after you get your boundaries functioning and you've got self-love going and you've had one of these repatterning relationships or you're in the midst of a repatterning relationship, where you actually come to the place where you want to start opening your heart again. So where I feel like for trauma victims, the typical, like, I think it's called Tonglen practice, I'm probably may not even be pronouncing that right, but where you're basically taking in suffering and giving out relief in the form of peace and happiness. So the real issue with this for trauma survivors is that you tend to default into that place where you're negating what happened to you. So I created a modified loving kindness practice, which is, even though X is a shithead motherfucker, I breathe in his or her suffering and I breathe out peace and happiness. And you could take that a step further and actually sort of break from that formula and just wish the person peace and happiness. But the important thing is that when you cross over into wanting to open your heart to the world and really wanting to be in this loving kindness space, that you don't lose track of the truth of violation when that happens. I tell my clients, before you start moving into loving the world better, you need to be able to identify a violation in 2 seconds flat, call it what it is, and then decide consciously what to do with it. Otherwise, you just reinforce these same collapsing patterns that we described earlier. And that's pretty much all I have, Mia.
Well, that's more than a little thank you. That's awesome. Wonderful. Wonderful.
I'm hoping it was in layman's terms enough that it wasn't overwhelming and that it made sense to everyone.
It's great. It really, a lot of Rebecca's work, some people are afraid of it because it really gets down into the depth of who we are and how we look at ourselves. And for many people who, I'm going to say, who wants to look at themselves, it's not an easy thing, and you have to be brave and courageous to take these steps forward in your healing. But the life that you create and change is incredible, and it's so worth it. It really is worth it. So I suggest you take these to heart.
I totally agree, Mia. And I think, when people come to me, I say to them, don't tell me that you're in pain. Tell me if you're in enough pain to make this worth your while. Because it really is a deep dive into places that we have often learned to shut down. And that's the road to opening up the love that we so crave.
It's awesome. Now, I'm not sure, I think we talked about this. Are you offering a free gift? Would you like to share your free gift? You have a bunch of them on your website, don't you?
Well, we didn't talk about it. I actually offer on my website something called the Trauma Alchemy Quiz.
Yes. Which is fun.
Yeah, so you take the Trauma Alchemy Quiz and it tells you what your primary trauma coping strategy is. And you get a report that actually tells you what the underlying genius is, because really my philosophy is that all of these strategies that I've just talked about are really fabulous strategies for living through trauma. That's how they developed. They become worthless to us when we try to transition into creating more collaborative, pleasurable, supportive relationships. And so they become a hindrance. It's really all contextual. So in those reports, you find out what your style is, and then you find out what the genius is and how you can unleash that genius.
I think it's incredible.
And anyone who takes, thanks. Oh, sorry.
No, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
We had a delay there for a second. So anyone who takes the Trauma Alchemy quiz can also apply for my complimentary strategy session. It's only going to be complimentary actually for a little while longer because I'm working to fill a year-long program that's kind of on rolling admission, just because of how the program functions. So anyone who takes the time to do the quiz will get a link to the application. So I guess that would be my free gift offering for today. Instructions have actually been revised at the beginning, so I tell people, and maybe this is a good time to mention it, you're not going to see any responses on the test that actually put you in a good light. It's like uncomfortable for people because I tell people at the end of the instructions, so get in touch with your lower self and do your dead level best. Dead level worst.
You know, it's amazing because a lot of people don't realize that when we have trauma in our life, when we're young, it really produces this chaos and drama throughout our life that, like you're talking about, and they can continue because we bring people in. Well, we know we bring people in, but you explain specifically how our brain works to attract others like that. And so stepping out and changing, you can change who you are, and you can change your environment by radically changing your thought process. But it takes work, and it takes dealing with everything that comes up that needs to be healed. So I love Rebecca's work. Rebecca helped me with something in the spring that was pretty powerful, my father, which was an awesome relationship, but I never dealt with his death or anything like that. So it was really very, very cool to have her work with me on that. So loved it.
Well, it was an honor to do that, Mia. And
as you know, I don't have people work with me on that stuff because most of it's healed. And we also have to trust who we work with. So.
Well, and that's what I want to say. Like, I really want to drive home that it's not enough, actually, to start trying to change our thought processes. Yes, that's a beginning. The breathing is a beginning. Anything that brings greater awareness is a beginning. But really, where the meat of the change happens is in a trust-based relationship. Where, so like when you're involved in trauma, you learn to trauma bond. That means you bond with people who are in your trauma pattern. So the way that you actually come out of that is to find a relationship of trust where you can create a healthy bond that will override. Like sometimes I have my clients actually imagine like whacking off their attractors for these unhealthy pattern relationships and creating the new attractors that are actually connected to their own desire. So that's another step too, which is to actually begin to see and imagine that you're repatterning the way your neurons fire and repatterning around these healthy bonding relationships.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. We are over, which is, oh wow, we're over. Okay. Thank you so much, Rebecka, for joining us and for talking with us and sharing your amazing work and you. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Mia, and thanks for the personal vote of confidence. It means the world.
You're welcome. And thank you all. We'll see you in another episode. And her town said goodbye.
Or hello.
Exactly. Come again. All right. We'll see you all later. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.